Looks like we're going to have a good crowd.
It's maybe the second largest crowd. Maybe the second largest crowd behind my Brooks Baxter. I got one that failed.
Oh, really?
Brooks Baxter.
That's funny.
Sorry, I had to fight with the printer. You ready?
Sure.
Okay. Is this on? You got it on?
Doesn't sound like it.
It's not plugged in. How does it plug in? Huh? Well, on and it's not working. The light is not. Well, I'm happy for not plugging it in. You know what? I could have plugged it up.
I'll take that blame.
I could have plugged it up too, so it's my fault.
These people don't care.
No, it's easier to blame somebody else.
You're up now.
Okay. Can you hear me, Amanda? Okay, great. All right, thank you everybody for coming to our brown bag lunch lecture. I'm Leah Lambert, I'm the Adult Education Coordinator, and I want to welcome you all to any of the refreshments at any point in this. If you need a refill in the middle, Brian is not going to get mad at you for getting up and getting a refill. And we do have trash cans and recycling bins by the door. A couple of announcements before I let Brian get started. On Wednesdays, we have a Little Beginnings toddler program. It's free and it's from 10:30 to 11, and it's a lot of fun. So if you know anybody that has a toddler and they need help entertaining them, let them know about that program. Tomorrow, we're going to have our second Friday art night from 5 to 8. Friday, October the 20th, the Navy Band is going to be here, and they're going to put on a performance from noon to 1. That is also going to be free. And Thursday, October 26th, 5:30 to 8:30, we're going to be having our museum, as is a bunch of the other museums in town. So it's kind of fun to hop around to all those and see what they're all doing. November the 9th is our next brown bag. It's going to be Scott Whitley Carter, and he's going to talk about the Turkey Bowl, a look at Thanksgiving football games in Arkansas. So talk about that and that rivalry that we've got going on for years. So today, Brian is doing his annual, semi-annual brown bag on kind of haunted stuff. He always comes and does something about the paranormal or one time he
weird
did Bonnie
stuff.
Creek Monster, just all sorts of kind of weird stuff that happened in Arkansas, and he always wants to do these in October, so they're kind of fun. He has a bachelor's and a master's from the University of Central Arkansas, and he has been on staff at the Arkansas State Archives now since 2008 as an archival assistant, where he works on educational programs. So let's give it up for Brian.
I never really know what to say to a crowd when you are doing one of these things at noon, because you can't necessarily say good morning, and afternoon doesn't quite work. So, and I've never heard anybody say happy noon. So I'm not sure. Maybe I guess it is technically afternoon, so we could go with that. And she stumbled a little bit when she was saying Arkansas State Archives, because it's something that took me a long time to get used to, not saying the Arkansas History Commission. So now I just tell people we are the artists formerly known as the Arkansas History Commission. So there's one thing that you learn when you get into the history field is that you have to stick to academic topics, right? And so haunted things don't fit into an academic topic, but I've found that I enjoy talking about non-academic topics pretty well. And it all kind of stems back from when I was a kid. A lot of times I would stay with my grandparents on the weekend, and one of the things that they would do is they would take their tithe money for the church and they would put it in books. And that's where they would keep their tithe money to kind of set it aside so they wouldn't accidentally spend it. And sometimes they would forget which book they put it in. And so when I was a kid, it was always a joy to go through their bookshelf and see if we could find, if we could find any of these treasures that are been forgotten by our grandparents. And they actually had some pretty interesting books on their bookshelves. And one of the books that I got kind of fascinated in was a book called Ozark Tales and Superstitions. And that was a book that I probably read hundreds of times. If I thought hard enough about it, I could probably think about, what the illustrations that have accompanied each story. And so I've had this kind of lifelong interest in this kind of thing. And so today I'm going to talk about one of those things that didn't appear in the book, but probably could have, because it is an Ozark topic. And I'm going to talk about the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs. So since the 1880s, Eureka Springs has been kind of the destination for Arkansans. Lots of marriages happen up there. Lots of people go up there for, during the summertime, etc. And this is something that goes all the way back into the 1880s and probably before, back into the 1870s. But when their vacation is over, the holiday goers usually just, they pack up their stuff and then they go home. But and they say goodbye to what a lot of the advertisements over the years have referred to as a Switzerland of Arkansas. And they think it kind of fits, with the mountainous terrain, etc. Well, while these vacationers leave, they end up leaving some things behind. And if one is inclined to believe in ghosts, they usually leave these ghosts still sitting back there in Eureka Springs. And there's lots of stories that have come out over the years, not just at the Crescent Hotel, but in other places in Eureka Springs. But I'm just going to focus today on the Crescent Hotel because that's the one that most people are familiar with. Well, people have been telling stories about these haunts that populate the Ozarks for years. And one of the focal points has been the Crescent Hotel. Hotel certainly has a history that kind of invites such stories. It started out as a hotel and then turned into a women's college and then into a somewhat disreputable hospital and then back into a hotel that it is now. And at each stage of its development, it's kind of left these stories behind that people have told. So perhaps the best way to begin the story is to talk about how did Eureka Springs come to be what we know it to be. Well, unlike other towns in the area, Eureka Springs doesn't necessarily have a lot to draw visitors into the town. But one thing it certainly does have is its hot springs. And the act of going to a natural spring for a holiday is something that goes all the way back into Roman times. But the Victorians really perfected the act of going to the baths. That was, it was kind of common to go on holiday and go to the baths. And that's something that's they're kind of well known for. And because of this, towns with hot springs ended up kind of flourishing pretty well. And Eureka Springs, with this many natural springs, became one of the great tourist attractions beginning in the 1870s for Arkansas. Let's see, I want to show you some advertisements that appeared. Let's see, okay. Well, much of the town's founding is kind of shrouded in legend. There's a couple of legends I want to talk about as far as the town's founding. Many of the early guidebooks that were published in the 1880s about the town suggested that the town was the site of a legendary fountain of youth that have been talked about by Native Americans in the area for years. Whether that's true or not, I'll leave that to you. You're going to do whatever you need to do to attract people to your town. But most early guidebooks tell of an old man named Judge Saunders who was suffering from a number of ailments and went to go see his doctor, and his doctor told him he needed to go, as they would say back then, take the waters. So he would go to the local bath and see if that was going to help him. Well, for him, he went to Eureka Springs in 1880 to soothe his leg ailment that he was suffering from. And during his stay at the Eureka Springs, Judge Saunders claimed that not only did it heal his leg, but the waters helped him to lose 40 pounds. And as he wrote in a guidebook, quote, portions of my hair changed from yellowish white to black, its original color. The color of the hair then grown was not changed, but a new crop grew out of the scalp of the color of my hair in my younger days. So not only does it help your leg ailments and other kinds of things, but it can also cure baldness, which is something maybe I should head up that way, because that's becoming a concern for me. Well, it seems that these waters also could cure a number of ailments, and so a lot of the doctors kind of latched onto this and started prescribing going to Eureka Springs for their patients. Well, the other story that kind of surrounds this legend of Eureka Springs tells about an old man who was out hunting with his son. They were out hunting bears, and while they were out there, their dog was chasing a bear into a cave, and the dog got kind of stuck in the cave, and they couldn't figure out how to draw the dog back out of the cave. So the old man went back to his house to get some tools in order to cut through the brush to get into the cave. And while he was in there, his son was kind of waiting for him to return, and so he got a little hot that day, so there's a little stream running nearby, so he dipped his hand in the stream and kind of washed it over his face. And lo and behold, this young man who was suffering from what was termed as eye ailments suddenly had no problem seeing. So this apparently healed his eyesight, or so he claimed. So he was able to get back to his house, and of course everything ends up snowballing from there. They tell their friends, and their friends tell their friends, etc. Well, some of these illnesses that are claimed to be cured by the Eureka Springs during that time were blindness, paralysis, liver complaints, asthma, and chronic constipation. Typical story was that of Jenny Cowan, who was a blind woman from Independence, Kansas, who came to Eureka Springs. And she had been suffering from blindness for 7 years due to having a meningitis. And she got there and stayed in town for 6 weeks, constantly drinking the spring water, bathing in it, and so on. Suddenly she felt a sharp pain in her forehead, and this is a pain that was almost blinding, or hurt so bad that finally, when it started to go away, she told her, suddenly erupted to everybody who was near her, I can see, I can see. So there's plenty of doctors who were happy to publish such testimonials about from themselves and their patients about whether these cure rumors are true or not. Well, pretty soon newspapers throughout the Midwestern United States published advertisements hoping to draw visitors to the new town. By the 1880s, newspapers in Texas advertised the town as the destination for Texas vacationers. The Huntsville Record worried that a large crowd were arriving with no place to stay, and so they were worried. They noticed that a lot of people were just kind of showing up. There weren't any kind of hotels or anything like that. Remember, this is a kind of a frontier town with very little population. And so these people were kind of sleeping in their wagons, and they were just kind of camping out in the open air, which is maybe not the best thing to do if you're suffering from some kind of an ailment. But those who did come were expecting cures and not visits from doctors, so there were very few doctors who were in town. And Dr. T.E. Russell worried that such stories were starting to attract quacks to the town as well. He worried that legitimate doctors would go broke trying to treat some of these people because what they wanted were cures, not necessarily treatment. Well, this is the environment in which some enterprising businessmen led by former Governor Powell Clayton decided to start to build a grand hotel. They gathered in 1886 to make their decision and pick their place. This hotel came with this was pretty staggering price for the time. It's $250,000 for this building, which in today's terms would be about $5 million. So this is a pretty large hotel. And it was in this period during its construction that the hotel gained its first spectral tenant. When supposedly an Irish bricklayer who was working fell to his death, and supposedly he's still there to this day, and people see him occasionally walking around the halls. Well, he's pretty much the grandfather of all of the Crescent's ghosts, and he's been there for over 130 years. And what a grand hotel it was. The hotel grew to be 3 stories high with elaborate Gothic spires and spires and towers. Inside the hotel lobby was awash in fine marble. The building was also one of the few in the state to boast of having electric lights. And of course, the running water drawn from the nearby curative springs was a must. And so when it opened, it drew a large crowd. Probably one of the most famous people who was there during the opening was James G. Blaine, who ran for the presidency of the Republican on the Republican ticket. Other names that showed up you would probably be familiar with, names like Woodruff, Logan Roots and his wife were there, among other kind of state dignitaries. But unfortunately for this hotel, although it really packed them in pretty well for a little while, this was the Gilded Age, and soon the fortunes of these kinds of grand holiday destinations started to fade. The bathing fad that seemed to kind of mark the 19th century started to kind of fall off, and most bathers also found that other towns were more accessible. Towns like Hot Springs, which had a more developed infrastructure, those became, Hot Springs became the destination for most people. And so as a result, the Crescent Hotel ended up kind of suffering from struggling to keep its occupants. Financial hardship led to the court ending up taking over the hotel, and they ended up selling it in 1901 to another group of investors for pennies on the dollar. They sold it for $30,000. Unfortunately, this didn't help the hotel survive, and by 1906 the hotel was only open during the summer. They couldn't draw enough people to justify the hotel being open during the wintertime, and even then it struggled to make ends meet. And this is where the hotel ends up entering into its second life, and that is as a women's college. Instead of leaving the hotel empty for 9 months and being only open for 3, they decided that during the 9 months that the hotel would not be open, they would open the hotel as a women's college. Owner W.L. Hemingway decided this and got with investors, and they all made this happen. The college was pretty exclusive. They only took 80 students at a time. Students came from families of the newly rich people in Oklahoma and Texas. Very few Arkansans actually ended up enrolling in the women's college. Academic subjects were what would be expected of young ladies to learn in the early 20th century. Music, art, expression, domestic science, child welfare. Now, higher mathematics and Latin were strictly forbidden. You can't have your women or young ladies learning such crude topics like that. Well, the rules for the students were also very quaint. Once arriving at this new college, young women were allowed to bring only a handful of items with them, including a Bible, a raincoat, napkin ring, and an umbrella. Beyond these essentials, students were required to get permission from the college president to buy any additional stuff for their own personal use. Of course, the clothing was a standard uniform of the time. It was a dark blue waistcoat over a modest white dress. We have a photograph of some of these women here. Let's see. There we go. The young women were also required to give the president a list of any correspondence that they might be in touch with. And if they were to want to add anybody to their list, they'd also have to have approval from the president. And students were also forbidden to speak to anybody in town, any of the Eureka Springs citizens. This is all designed to kind of protect the morals of these young women. Well, all of this came at a yearly tuition of $400, which is that's pretty steep. But again, they're taking their students are coming from these oil-rich, nouveau-rich people from Texas and Oklahoma. Well, according to legend, at least one of these students still lives there tuition-free. And the story goes that this young woman was either pushed or fell from the railing to the grounds below, and she's been seen by modern guests walking the grounds in her chaste uniform. Now, if she doesn't speak to you, you know why she doesn't speak to you, because she's not allowed. So, well, over the years, this hotel continued to struggle to stay afloat, and it ended up closing its doors in 1934. And then a medical huckster named Norman Baker came to town. And Baker had already had kind of a sketchy past. He was known to dress in purple shirts all the time, and he actually had a purple car that he rode around in. And while he's out riding around in his purple car, he's telling people that he has the cure for cancer. Well, he based his operations in the early 1930s in a town called Muscatine, Iowa. And that's where he built his empire, hawking his cancer cures. He established a string of hospitals throughout the Midwest and ran several radio stations, all advertising his wares. Most of his radio stations were below the border and were not subject to FCC licensing restrictions. And so they would be able to kind of blast their signal all across the country without worrying about, the FCC cracking down saying, no, you have to keep it at this, this level, or else you're going to drown out everybody else. And so that's what he did, is he used his radio station to kind of broadcast that he had the cure for cancer, and that if you had cancer, here where you could find his hospitals. Well, he grew powerful enough that he actually ran for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate from Iowa, and also ran for governor at one point on an obscure party in the early 30s called the Farm Labor Party. Well, of course, claiming to be able to cure cancer also gets you a lot of attention from medical authorities. And beyond the hopeful people rushing to be healed, he also drew the ire of the American Medical Association. He criticized him openly and often. Studying his elixir, the AMA announced that it contained no more than watermelon seeds, clover seeds, corn silk, and water. Well, soon a grand jury in Muscatine indicted him for practicing medicine without a license, and his empire began to crumble, so he left town. And where does he wind up but right here in Arkansas? In 1937, he came to Eureka Springs and bought the vacant hotel for a song. He spent $50,000 renovating the hotel and turning it into a hospital. Among his renovations was an elevator shaft. So if you're ever at the hotel and you're riding on the elevator, remember you have Mr. Baker to thank for that. The opening ceremony was enough to draw plenty of attention. He sponsored a dance in the lobby, which you think about how many hospitals do you know are trying to draw patients are going to have a dance in the lobby, but that's what he did. Here he doubled down on his claims. Now, not only could he cure cancer, but he's able to cure, quote, all known ailments. Well, according to testimony at his later trial for mail fraud, Baker was known to hire healthy people to sit on the balcony and pretend to be patients of his that had been cured by his anecdotes. And word of mouth got around. Hundreds of cancer-stricken people also came to this hospital hoping to be cured. And hundreds died waiting for their cure. It was estimated that Baker raked in as much as $4 million at his hotel. All of that from the most desperate people and the desperate circumstances. It was not just in Eureka Springs, though, that Baker's schemes had snared the sick. He also had another string of hospitals set up all across the United States, even one as far away as Brisbane, Australia. Well, he continued to meet resistance from the medical community. Every time a medical professional would claim that Baker's so-called cures were not effective, he would end up filing a lawsuit for slander and libel. One medical journal that published a critical article about Baker's methods was met with a $450,000 lawsuit. Baker also filed a suit seeking $8 million in damages from a movie studio that produced a film that was critical of him. He even sued the American Medical Association for libel, asking for $500,000 in damages, but was unsuccessful. Baker remarked, quote, "My job is to sell the beauty, health, and many advantages of the Ozarks to the public, as I consider them the most beautiful spot that I've found in all of my travels. And I'll do the job well, even though I encounter the resistance of the medical profession throughout the country." Well, Baker was fond of his ostentatious displays, as you might imagine from somebody who dresses all in purple and has a purple car whose name is not Prince. And he ends up on the first anniversary of taking over the hotel and turning it into a hospital. He had a large fireworks display where he had a show called Niagara Falls in the Sky, if you can imagine what that might be like. Well, it's not long before Baker's claims came also to the attention of Arkansas's medical establishment and the federal government. On September 22nd, 1939, a federal court indicted Baker for making dubious claims through the mail. The indictment charged that Baker claimed that, quote, "remedies and treatments recommended and used by members of the American Medical Association would not and could not in any event cure cancer, and that Norman Baker had, during the year 1929, discovered and perfected a sure cure for cancer." Well, Baker countered that he was actually not the owner of this hospital. He was just a mere administrator. Of course, he could never tell anybody who actually owned this hospital that he was just administrating. He claimed that all of his financial dealings were with his businesses in Mexico and that he was not making any money from this hospital. But he still defended the hospital even though he did not, quote, own it. He responded that he would only answer the charges in court if he was allowed to bring in 1,200 cured patients to testify on his behalf. Well, of course, the court did not accept this offer, and he ended up going to trial in 1939. Well, the trial was horrible to his reputation. Witnesses described sick patients, quote unquote sick patients, who were put on display but were really healthy people. One of the damaging displays occurred between M.N. Bunker, who had a show where he would analyze handwriting on the radio. How that would work, I'm not quite sure. But he had a show on one of these Mexican radio stations owned by Baker, and they ended up kind of having a falling out at one point over what Mr. Bunker described as ethical issues. And so he was called to testify against Baker in his trial, and he testified that during a conversation with Baker, Baker told him, quote, if he could keep his hospital and radio station open a year, he could make $1 million out of it. Did he ever use the term suckers? Asked the prosecutor. Yes, he said suckers, Bunker replied. It was also revealed in court that his staff physician, Dr. O.L. Beatty, did not actually attend college in Kansas City College, and had received his medical diploma in 1928 from a diploma mill that he paid $800. So Baker ends up being convicted in federal court and ends up serving for 4 years in federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. And when he gets out in 1945, he leaves Arkansas and goes to Florida, where he thinks he's going to continue his medical activities. He was wanting to kind of mount a comeback attempt. And so in order to do this, he had to file a petition with the Attorney General of Florida asking for the ability to open up this brand new medical practice. That, by the way, he wouldn't call a medical practice. He would say that it was a research foundation, whatever that means. Well, Florida officials were understandably wary of allowing Mr. Baker to do anything of the sort. So they end up turning him down, and Baker ends up having to retire. But don't feel too bad for Mr. Baker, because he ends up retiring a very rich man. He ends up living on a yacht off the Florida coast. So he wasn't hurting for money. But ironically, he ends up dying several years later from cancer. So maybe there's some justification there. But his time at the Eureka Springs left the most lasting mark on the Crescent Hotel. It's said by residents that some of them still see the patients wandering the halls around the Crescent Hotel. Some people have seen even Baker himself strolling the grounds in his purple suit. A nurse has been spotted wheeling a cart down the halls, and then there's the ghostly patients, many of whom are seen in the basement of the hotel, which during Baker's time operated as a morgue. Today, the Crescent Hotel is now one of the most popular tourist attractions in the town, and visitors pour into the hotel constantly to admire the architecture and to see any kind of these spectral residents who live in the hotel. But before one goes to the hotel hoping to be scared, just know that not all of the Crescent's permanent occupants are known to be scary. The Irish bricklayer that I mentioned at the first of my talk has been known to have a sense of whimsy. He prefers to stay in room 218, where he's been known to pull pranks on guests, such as turning on the air conditioner during the wintertime and turning on the heater during the summertime. Another ghost named Theodora was a patient during the hospital period, and she's been known to neatly fold clothing in guest rooms. So if you're ever there and you have some laundry that needs done, then she's your gal. So try to find her. These rooms are by far the most popular rooms in the hotel, and you can find that there's usually as long as a 2-year wait to get in them. So maybe in 2 years, if you're interested in doing that, you might want to make a call this afternoon. They were 419 and 218. The current owners of the hotel do not shy away from their ghostly past either. They're known to have ghost tours and so forth, and they're glad to offer ghost tours of the hotel. But nevertheless, whether one tends to believe in ghosts, it's no doubt that the hotel's strange history is enough to continue to draw visitors to the hotel for years to come.